Hi, this is Fran Mayer, and welcome to another Napa Institute webcast. Mary Hallen FioRito is an attorney, wife, and mother. She's also a respected author, public lecturer, and cultural commentator from a Catholic perspective on a wide range of national issues. She served for 18 years as a senior advisor and assistant to the late Cardinal Francis George of Chicago, and currently serves as the Cardinal Francis George Fellow in Catholic Studies at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. She has a special focus on women's leadership in the Catholic Church and pro-family, pro-life affairs, as well as today's national debates over physician-assisted suicide, euthanasia, and other issues bearing on a consistent ethic of life. She's also a longtime friend of the Napa Institute, so it's a particular pleasure to welcome her today. Thanks for being with us, Mary.
Oh, Fran, thank you for asking me. Always a pleasure to be with our friends from Napa.
Now, Mary, I'm smiling as I'm going to ask you this question. On March 6th, you published an excellent and provocative piece in the Chicago Tribune entitled Xavier Becerra is a poor choice for HHS secretary. As I read it, I thought you've probably earned a place on the current administration's permanent naughty not nice Christmas list. What's wrong specifically with Mr. Becerra as Health and Human Services Secretary?
Well, I don't think I was ever on the Christmas list to begin with, so I'm not too hurt if they cut me off of it. If there will even be Christmas celebrated, who knows? We may have some other kind of, solstice of some sort that will be observed instead of Christmas. But yeah, so Xavier Becerra is problematic in a whole lot of different ways. I guess primarily, if you look at it sort of unemotionally, he has no background in public health at all or medicine at all. He is a prosecutor. He's apparently quite a good prosecutor. But in order to run Health and Human Services, one needs to have a certain working knowledge of the kinds of programs and services that Health and Human Services provides. So the very fact that he was nominated sort of raised suspicions, I suppose, for lack of a better word, right away. And from what I kind of heard from people I know in DC who follow these things, Xavier Becerra is very much supported by Planned Parenthood. He is completely endorsed by the Planned Parenthood Federation of America. And in order to earn that endorsement, you have to take certain very extreme stands publicly. You must oppose any ban on abortion after 20 weeks, for example. So that's how far they force you to go before they will give you their endorsement. So he came fully endorsed and supported by Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood, of course, was also very, very heavily involved in this particular presidential election. They donated approximately $45 million to the Biden and Harris campaign. And from what I hear, sort of the inside the Beltway news was that in exchange for that particular support, they wanted the HHS appointment, and which makes perfect sense because the HHS appointment would be charged with funneling a lot of the monies that would go to clinics like Planned Parenthood. So I think that's where that came from, because just looking at his credentials, and again, he's a seasoned legal prosecutor, criminal prosecutor. It's not like he is not a credentialed person, but he's credentialed in very much the wrong way for this appointment. So this was pointed out by Senator Bill Cassidy, also, I believe, a friend of the Napa Institute and has attended some events. He's a physician, practiced for many years before he became a senator, and very respectfully during the Senate Finance Committee hearings, he asked the Attorney General Becerra, do you have knowledge of this program or that program, or how would you handle this? And he said he came away very troubled by the lack of basic familiarity that Mr. Becerra had with the programs that HHS runs, for which he will be responsible. So that's just sort of from a very, again, unemotional take on it. Now, if we as Catholics and pro-lifers examine this a little more closely, we find additional concerns. The first would be Becerra's attempt to essentially silence pregnancy resource centers in the state of California. Your listeners may be familiar with the case Becerra versus NIFLA, or I think by the time it got to the Supreme Court, it was NIFLA versus Becerra, where he had attempted to force Christian and Catholic pro-life pregnancy centers that offer women alternatives to abortion. He had attempted to force them to place in their lobbies. So as women came in, clients came in to visit with these pregnancy center counselors, advertising for the free abortion services in California and actually referring women to those abortion providers. So very much mandating a particular message that these pregnancy centers would have to give to anyone who came to see them for assistance, and undermining the very foundations of their work, undermining what they were established for in the first place. So thankfully, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 against Mr. Becerra and in favor of the pregnancy centers. And what I pointed out in my piece, you could go online and read this if anyone's interested, really the most compelling reasoning came from the justice everyone thought was kind of the swing vote and the moderate, and that was Anthony Kennedy. The California state legislature had kind of patted itself on the back and, congratulated Becerra for being so forward thinking. And it's actually a very funny legal opinion. Anthony Kennedy notes, it would actually be forward thinking if you all went back and read the First Amendment and how suppressive governments attempt to make people speak messages with which they do not agree. And so that was a particularly galling case, I think, for pro-lifers. And it also shows you, I think, just practically speaking, the threat that pregnancy resource centers pose to the abortion industry and their bottom line. Planned Parenthood is always saying that they're a non-for-profit. However, their bread and butter funding every year comes from abortion services. Right. And of course, many abortion clinics are private for-profit clinics. The vast majority of abortions don't happen in hospitals. They happen in independent, private abortion clinics that are for-profit entities. And every time a woman chooses to go to a pregnancy center and receive the help of the pro-life community, that's another abortion that doesn't happen at one of those clinics.
Mm-hmm. Mary, given what you've just told us, I mean, how does this fit with President Biden's very public acknowledgement of his Catholic identity? I mean,
yeah.
The rosary beads are out a lot of the time, and he's very proud of it. He takes it very seriously. It's clear that it does mean something to him. But how does that translate into the actions that are kind of unfolding from the White House?
Well, as we used to say around the office, that's sort of, these are things, internal forum matters, as we would have called them, between the person and his confessor. But it does kind of befuddle one to think how he can so openly profess his faith and so clearly at the same time advocate for things that his faith, whether it's specifically Catholic or Christian, mandates against. If we go back to the very earliest catechism, if you will, it's called the Didache, which is kind of the basic rules for living that the first Christians lived by, those who really would have known from Christ specifically. It explicitly condemns abortion in a Roman Empire where it was widely practiced. So we know from the very first foundations of Christianity and the Catholic Church that those early communities spoke out quite vociferously against abortion. Yet Joe Biden seems to find pretty much any way to support it. And I'm not even just saying he's using the old personally opposed but sort of argument. He is actively funding them. He took $45 million in campaign donations from the nation's largest abortion provider. I think there are some seriously grave issues there. Of course, he's also presided at 2 same-sex weddings. So we know that his adherence to the church's teaching on the sacrament of marriage and the family are also deficient. I can't claim to know his heart or what he has discerned. So I'm concerned for him just kind of not only personally, but I'm concerned also for the people who are advising him. Who are his spiritual directors? Who's giving him this guidance that says, you can be personally opposed to pretty much anything, but just not support it in policy? I don't know. It's very difficult to look at him and think, wow, this is a guy who was at least trying. Do you know what I'm saying? It's hard. Politics is difficult. There's sometimes you have to hold your nose and vote for something. I know Catholic legislators who have told me, I didn't like this particular bill. I had real qualms of conscience, but at the end of the day, I managed to figure out a way I could adjust it somehow, or I could speak against it, or I could try to make it less bad than it was, but you don't sense any of that from.
No, his attitude really is, there's a striking difference between President Biden's attitude and, you're a personal friend of former Congressman Dan Kinski, who was Democrat, a committed congressman, but had a very different attitude toward what his Catholic identity actually meant.
And he paid for it.
Yeah, and he paid for it. and which
Yeah.
is also a big lesson, a
Yeah.
significant lesson. Mary, you've done you've done an exceptional job of integrating an impressive professional life with marriage and family. And you didn't work for, well, you worked for a guy who was a terrific guy, but a man with a lot of demands that would roll downhill onto you. So, I mean, how did you do it? I mean, how does, in the culture that we're in, women are expected to be more engaged in the home, rightly or wrongly, than men. And it just seems to be a very difficult balance to strike, and you've done a great job doing it. How did you do it?
Well, that's thoughtful. I mean, first of all, I have to give credit to my husband, who was, of course, shares a deep love of the Catholic Church. We met at the office, in fact. So he was always a very strong believer, particularly in my contributions to pro-life work, because especially sort of early on, if you remember sort of the late 80s and early 90s in the pro-life movement, when Planned Parenthood versus Casey was decided and some other major decisions, it was really important to have women who were out there, who were educated. I'm an attorney by training, who could make those kind of contributions. And I also have to say, my supervisors from Cardinal George on down, starting with Cardinal Bernardine, in fact, were very understanding, especially when my children were smaller, and gave me the flexibility to be able to sort of pick up work on weekends if I had to, when my husband would be home. So both my husband and my employer responded to the times, as they were. And you go through seasons as a parent, you know that yourself, right? There's times when your children sort of need you more at home. And then once they go to school, there's times when you can work at different times of the day. So I was always so grateful that, I had that flexibility at a time where working from home wasn't really done regularly. And I didn't have the type of job like, say, for example, a physician. I have a couple of friends who are OBGYNs, and, for some of them, their husbands just took part-time jobs because they had to be there physically to deliver children. And I wasn't in that. I could write a legal brief anywhere, right? So I wasn't in that particular position. But Cardinal George felt very strongly about having women who were also mothers, who were also spouses, as sort of part of the team, because so much of what the church does and addresses deals with people like me and people like you and your wife, the concerns of families. And if you never interact with people who are working families, then it's the policies and procedures and statements you might come up with may not really reflect people's lived experience. And so it wound up being just a really wonderful situation for me. Not every day was perfect. I mean, there were days when I thought, am I doing the right thing? This is very hard. If you have a sick child, you know what that's like. But it's, I felt God was calling me to do it, particularly to the pro-life piece of the work.
Mary, I'm sure you're very conscious of the fact that the culture in general diminishes the value of staying home and having children and being a wife and mother. I'm wondering why that is. I mean, have you done any thinking about that in terms of...
very much so. And, because my husband and I both worked for the church, and ironically, because we wanted our children to attend Catholic schools, both of us working was sort of a necessity if we wanted that particular piece. And, we live in Illinois. Our property taxes are extremely high. So if you were going to pay both those and Catholic school tuition, generally that means two working parents. And it's kind of a catch-22 situation. It's a difficult thing for any family to decide. And I think that's where the church is so understanding and merciful, that every family has to kind of come to that conclusion individually. So it doesn't mandate, right, that all moms should, be full-time wives and mothers. But at the same token, I mean, to me, my friends, I was jealous of my friends who could stay home full time. And I still am to some extent. Perhaps jealousy isn't a great virtue of mine, but I always saw that. And I think many people, at least where I live, see that as a beautiful luxury to have. And especially too, if you're open to life, right? And you have a number of children. And this is something where I think the church might need to take a little bit of a harder look, is, those big family discounts that we got when I was a kid in Catholic grade school, anything over 3, you were paying much less for the 4th, 5th, and 6th child than you were. Those generally don't exist anymore. And Catholic education can be very, very expensive for those of us who want it and choose it and don't want our kids exposed to some of the things you're hearing in the public schools. You do have to kind of make that sacrifice. Now, I also know stay-at-home moms who are making heroic heroic sacrifices. They moved kind of way outside of the city limits for more affordable housing, and their homeschooling, which is also, I think, has become, it's moved from being sort of a odd niche, that people associated maybe with the Amish, to really being a very mainstream and respected form of bringing up your children, not only as educated people who are well-rounded, but also bringing them up as very faithful Catholics. And I think you look at the Scripps spelling bee, I think, haven't the last 10 winners all been homeschooled, I think?
Yeah, well,
Have,
the other thing too
yeah,
is that certainly in Philadelphia, the number of seminarians, I mean, young men entering the seminary are
right,
disproportionately from homeschool backgrounds. And I think
right.
in the bishops that I've interviewed, that tends to be a pattern. I mean, that's where a disproportionate number of vocations are coming from.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I hadn't heard that piece of it, but it doesn't surprise me, but it's interesting. I think, maybe that was one of the gifts too that the COVID lockdown brought, was that people realized, wait, I can do a lot of this at home. I don't have to send my child into a classroom where they might be hearing messages that I don't agree with every day. And if I can stay and supervise and really make sure that they're working well in this new sort of way of learning, this could be a great benefit. I know there have been many kids, particularly from poor families. We're seeing this a lot in the Chicago area, where hundreds and thousands even of kids are missing. They don't know where they are. They don't log in anymore for school, and social services cannot trace them. We've had like an increase, I think it's like 150% in carjackings,
Oh my
and it's all
goodness.
young teenagers who are doing it. And of course, it's kids, they either log in or they just don't log in at all, and off they go, and they're not being supervised at home. And you really do feel for parents. Maybe they're being raised in a single parent household where the mom is the only breadwinner or the dad's the only breadwinner, and he's got to go out to work and he doesn't have the money for a sitter. It's so there's the one side of that. But I do think the sort of positive side has been for our local domestic churches, our local families, to really learn to appreciate each other in a new way, not only just for learning, but also for prayer and for mass. We were locked down here in Chicago and in Illinois, I think, longer than many states were. There's a few others that might have exceeded us, but in terms of worship, I don't think we went to mass for 3 months, simply
Yeah.
because our churches weren't open. So, but we were good about watching scriptural films, different Bible series, even pulling up some old VeggieTales, and really trying to make at least Sunday the day where we thought about what Sunday means, and tried to participate in the liturgy as best we could. And boy, it also gives you a new appreciation for people who don't have the luxury of going to mass every Sunday, and people in different countries where they're either in an underground church or they have a traveling priest who comes through once a month. And we've been very blessed and very lucky, and I think took a lot of that for granted. So yeah, so it's one of those things where, again, there's silver linings in all of those clouds, but even still, there's the clouds still persist.
It's very demanding.
Hmm.
In terms of your attorney work and background, Mary,
Hmm.
how do you looking out on the American terrain right now? What are the issues that you see emerging that are of concern to you legislatively, judicially, even in the formation of attorneys now in law school? I mean,
Right.
where's your interest and what are you focused on?
Well, a lot of my work now, really more, not so much by choice, but by necessity, has been looking at religious liberty cases. I think the American public school system should be ashamed of itself for how people emerge from public education and have absolutely no understanding of what the Free Exercise Clause means, nor the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, which of course is what gives us our right to practice our religion frequently, or freely rather, and infrequently if we want to. And the pandemic's also brought that to a head, hasn't it? You see the cases, and this is another thing where this Xavier Becerra, where his nomination is problematic, his sort of strange interest in making sure that the Little Sisters of the Poor will not be granted any exemptions to the abortifacient and birth control mandate. That's very, very troubling. But then, to see further restrictions on houses of worship, the very questioning by Illinois Senator Dick Durbin and California's Dianne Feinstein of Amy Coney Barrett should have made any religious person have their hair on edge. And I was so grateful, speaking of, to see someone from the Anti-Defamation League, the ADF, saying to both Durbin and Feinstein, you are walking a fine line here. And there are constitutional prohibitions on making religion a litmus test for any job in government. And if you have not crossed the line already, you are perilously close to it. And if you go back and listen to the way in which, in very much a mocking tone, she was asked, "Are you an Orthodox Catholic?" That should never happen in this country. Her faith means, again, unless she's doing something illegal, has absolutely no bearing on her job. And there was an Orthodox Jewish rabbi who wrote in, I think it was to the New York Times, and said, there's a lot of things that we Orthodox Jews do that might make people stop and pause and say, well, that's really weird. You don't drive your car on Friday evening. You have to walk to your services, and you won't even flip on a light switch. Are you in a cult? I mean, he was saying, I understand as an Orthodox Jew that my practice of my faith makes a lot of people uncomfortable because they don't understand it. And I do not claim to know what the people of praise are, or, how that impacts their daily lives as Catholic Christians. But I would certainly be very concerned if this sort of, I don't know what we would call it, it being in vogue to question people about their religious faith, because this is exactly what the founders didn't want to happen. This is what the Puritans fled, right? And the Pilgrims fled from England. Any kind of religious question should not be brought into whether or not you can do a job for which religion has no connection.
Mary, when you look at if you take it to the area of pro-life affairs, how has the pro-life movement changed over the last, during the years that you've been involved? Mm-hmm. And what do you see as its challenges in the future?
Well, I think what's been a tremendous benefit to us, even more than before, has been ultrasound and neonatal technology. I have a nephew, for example, who was born at 22 weeks, 0 days, and is a very healthy and happy 3.5-year-old now. So we are seeing the viability going further and further and further back. In fact, Sandra Day O'Connor said that in one of her opinions, that Roe versus Wade is on a collision course with itself, because the more neonatal technology advances, the less and less reason we have for doing abortions past, say, 18 weeks or 19 weeks or 20 weeks. And so we are really seeing those things kind of collide with themselves, because, of course, what Roe and its companion case, Doe versus Bolton, permit is abortion for all 9 months for any reason. And, there's another factor. Americans don't really know that particular piece of it very well. So
they're encouraged not to know that.
Oh, correct. Of course. And occasionally you'll see a little thing, like maybe in the New York Times will have a moment of honesty, or, other secular papers. But, one thing that in its own gruesome way sort of helped to move the conversation along. Well, two things I would say culturally. First would have been the arrest and conviction of Kermit Gosnell, who was, of course, in your home state of Philadelphia there, or your city rather, and who was running for more than 20 years an abortion clinic where he regularly delivered living babies and then snipped their necks with a pair of scissors. And the two Irish journalists, Phelim McAteer and Anne McInerney, I think are their names, McAleer rather, Phelim McAleer, wrote a tremendous book called Gosnell, America's Biggest Serial Killer, and they were both pro-choice. They were not practicing Catholics. They came here just because they were so fascinated with the case to cover it. And they said, in a place like Ireland, this would have been on the front page of the papers every single day. And it took, Kristen Powers at USA Today snapping a picture of the empty press box at that trial, and then tweeting it out to shame the rest of the media into coming and covering what Dr. Gosnell had done. And, again, 20 years he was doing this, and he applied for membership in the National Abortion Federation, which is kind of like a trade association of abortion providers. And to their credit, they denied his membership every time he applied. But they also had gone through his clinic to inspect it. They saw the cat feces on the floor. They presumably saw the snipped off baby feet that he kept in jars all over the place to decorate. I mean, you talk about a macabre situation. So they did reject his application, but they never reported him to the Department of Public Health.
It's unbelievable.
And, it took a woman dying and a detective on the Philadelphia police force who said, well, wait, where's the death investigation? Where's the paperwork? And there wasn't one. And he pushed and he pushed, and he got a judge to give him permission to go in and they knew he was selling opioids illegally out of that clinic. That's something they knew was happening. So they kind of, they were able to piggyback that onto the abortion stuff. But it was really very eye-opening, I think, for a lot of people. Even the New York Times admitted that multiple members of the jury had to have psychological evaluations and support months later because of what they had to view in evidence. It was very traumatizing for the jury, a fact that the judge acknowledged, and I believe the court paid for it, was for them to have the psychiatric and emotional support that they needed after serving.
You know, Mary, well, you know that my own former boss, Archbishop Chaput, had a huge respect for Cardinal George, and you were critical to his success in a supporting role. So, I mean, what was it about Cardinal George that made him so exceptional as a leader in the church, and what kind of lessons should people draw from that?
Well, a couple of things. You know, the first I would say is that, you know, I just wish I'd followed him around with a tape recorder or something more, because he really did. He had intellectual gifts, I think, that come along maybe once in a generation. You know,
Yep.
he really did have a genius level IQ. And that's not a disparagement to any of our other bishops who are all very smart, but he was really a step above. He had 3 earned doctorate degrees. He spoke 5 languages fluently. Sort of a little bit like John Paul in that way, right? That real intellect, that real gift for analyzing issues. But also at the same time, he was a missionary. And there's one story that I'd like to tell that I think kind of sums him up as a person. And we had been at a forum. I was staff to him at that time, and so I had gone with him, where it was kind of up and coming young leaders from all over Chicago. So they get to know each other and they get to know major figures, you know, like the mayor. And obviously the archdiocese is such a big part of Chicago because of our big school system and our hospitals and things. So the cardinal was always one of the people on the list to meet. And so we had gone to this, and there was some, you know, woke 20-something-year-old who got up to ask him a question and said, you know, in the parish that I grew up in, my pastor always said there's 2 kinds of priests: those who want to serve the poor and those who want to be bishops. So which one are you? And he actually, Fran, said it in just that tone, in just that way. And I was sitting next to his priest secretary, and I think I grabbed his arm, like, I thought, oh my gosh, how is he going to handle this? And he looked at the guy and he kind of laughed. He said, you know what? He said, there may have been a point in my life where I would have thought that way as well. But he said, let me tell you, when he was the first native Chicagoan to be the archbishop here, grew up on Chicago's Northwest Side. And because he had been a childhood victim of polio, he had quite a big, heavy brace on one of his legs.
Right.
And our high school seminary at the time was in a very old building with lots of stairs that were in spirals, a lot of them. And the rector of the seminary was uncertain the cardinal could manage the chairs the stairs when he was a young boy, not to mention the fact he would have had to have taken 3 or 4 buses every day to get there. So his parents looked, he really wanted to be a priest though. He said right after his first communion, God put that on his heart. And so St. Henry's Seminary, which was the high school seminary for the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, which is a French religious missionary order, was in downstate Illinois, but the building was a ranch. So it was all in one level. So there were no stairs. You could navigate it easily. But when he left to join the Oblates at age 13, he said, I made 2 conscious choices. Number 1, I would never come back to Chicago because our order never sent anyone who entered back to their home cities. And number 2, I would never be a bishop because at the time, the Holy See didn't appoint men from religious orders like Archbishop Chaput, who was a conventual Franciscan. You were never appointed. Religious order priests never became bishops. They only were taken from the diocese for priests. He said, so those were the 2 choices I made. I wouldn't be back in Chicago and I'd never be a bishop. And yet here I am. So I just thought it was the perfect response because he just always did what God asked him. And again, it's one of those things. You hear said about John Paul II often, you know, he was always the smartest person in the room, but always also at the same time, the most humble and the kindest. And I think you saw that combination. And I think you yourself know the respect in which he was held by the other bishops, you know.
Chaput said he was the most impressive bishop that he had ever met.
Yeah, I can't think of like a book he didn't read or, well, this is another little funny story. There was one time the mayor decided to do this one book, one Chicago thing. And he asked, you know, a lot of the city's leading figures if they could send in an autographed copy of their favorite book when they were, I think, in 5th or 6th grade, something like that. So of course this task gets entrusted to me. So I have my little Amazon account open and I go and I said, okay, well, what was your favorite book in 5th grade? And he says to me, the encyclopedia. And I said, Cardinal, I am not do you know how much an encyclopedia costs? I'm like, it's 2000, whatever year it was, they don't make them anymore, A, and B, do you know how much it'll cost for me to find you one? And C, I'm not telling the entire city full of fifth graders that you read the encyclopedia. And he said, but I did, I liked it. It was interesting. So we found some other book that's out of print now about a young seminarian who solved mysteries, probably the precursor to the Father Brown series. But I remember that too. He just had such a curiosity about everything. And so, he read the encyclopedia for fun. And so, but he always, his whole life was for other people. I mean, up until I think it was maybe 48 hours before he died, he was sending me little notes saying, Mary, can you call so-and-so about and see how his mother's doing? Can you, we had an employee who had a very sick child with leukemia. He said, would you call him and ask how his daughter is? I'd like to know. And again, 48 hours before his death. So that gives you some sense about his always putting himself out for other people, even when he was really very sick and suffering at the end.
Mary, what special skills do women bring to leadership in the Catholic Church? I mean, you're a perfect example of the kind of leadership that the church really needs. I mean, how do you, I mean, it's traditionally a very male organization, obviously,
Right.
the priestly task of pastoring. But I mean, how do you see that working out in the future? I mean, what can women bring to the task?
Well, I think we see, and we've always seen in the church, women religious, of course, who have been in leadership positions long before that was acceptable in the secular world, religious women who are the presidents of universities and of hospitals and of other very significant organizations. So it's not as if the church has never said that the women don't have a particular calling or place in structures of leadership, but it just looked very different in a society where, women didn't generally hold those kind of jobs. In fact, I have a religious sister friend who's part of a French order, and they dress in very simple secular clothing, and they do that because when they were founded, they were to dress like the widows of the day, and because widows could go out unaccompanied by men. And so if they were going to go and visit the sick, they did not have to have a male companion escorting them if they went out dressed as widows. So that's what they did. It was very practical. But I mean, to your second question, I think, without kind of going down the, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, line of thinking, that generally, particularly women who are married with families, bring a certain sense of practicality. And again, this is not to disparage anyone who doesn't have that particular vocation in life. It's just, it is what it is. Sometimes if you're talking, for example, about starting a new program or maybe closing a school, someone who has school age children will tell you, you can't do that at this time of year. Parents have already made their plans. You can't tell an incoming eighth grader, in December, oh, sorry, our school's closing. You're not going to be able to graduate, find another school for the next 6 months. You just can't do those kind of things, right? So sometimes I think just your daily lived out practical experience as a parent can come to bear on policy conversations that it's not malice. It's just nobody would have had the personal lived, experience to have thought of that particular thing. And so, I think it sort of really mirrors Congress. And you mentioned that, that I'm friends with Congressman Lipinski, and we've had some conversations about this, about how, you really do need people from all sorts of walks of life, because anything that you do impacts people almost universally, right, in the country. So you want to make sure that you're thinking of not of every single situation that might happen, right? There's that old saying, hard cases make bad law, but you want to at least be aware of the different constituencies and what their particular concerns might be. So I think that's where sort of having women at the table is really critical. Now, that being said, I do think there's a place for men to gather together to pray together as men, and similarly for women, women's study groups or women's Bible groups. There's nothing wrong with that. And as we see gender roles and particular gender itself, being questioned more and more and more, I think those gifts are becoming even more critical for the church to say, no, we as women, the theology of the body that John Paul II so brilliantly put together and spoke of, God created who we are the way we are for a reason. And so that's also important to kind of really bring into focus at a time when we're seeing so many secular organizations trying to blur those lines.
Mary, I have one more question, and that is, the Napa Institute has a particular focus on informing and forming lay people to make a positive contribution to the renewal of the country.
Mm-hmm.
How should lay people be thinking about the church in this kind of really turbulent time? I mean, what should we be doing to
So,
help the church be her?
yeah, and I can't tell you that the times that I have been able to attend the Napa Institute, how much I have gotten out of them every single time. I learn something new every time I go from the speakers, from the topics that are discussed and raised. I think, though, for me as a laywoman, my greatest area of concern right now is a very or under catechized laity. And I kind of go back to an article that John Cavadini, who's the chair of the theology department at Notre Dame, wrote. And you might remember this. This is probably from 15 years ago. It was in Commonweal, of all places, where he talked about his incoming freshman class at Notre Dame, right? So the best and the brightest of young Catholicism, that the majority couldn't name the four Gospels. 80% didn't know what the Immaculate Conception was. We are really struggling with a tremendously uncatechized and under-catechized laity. And I'm not laying blame. I think we went through some formational periods in the 70s and 80s, and maybe even into the early 90s in particular, where, of course, your personal relationship with Christ was very important, and talking about God's love and God's mercy, agree with all of it. But in terms of sort of the fundamentals of the faith, that people don't understand them because they don't know them. And so you're having a conversation with somebody, and then you realize it's almost like you're speaking different languages, because you're assuming a knowledge on their part that doesn't exist. And they're not bad people, not malintended. No one's ever told me. It was funny. I was having a conversation. It's a very random little thing, but I was going to mass with somebody, and she like pulled a donut out of her, and I'm like, we're going to mass. You can't eat the donut. She's like, well, what do you mean? I'm like, you have to fast for an hour before you go to communion. And you would have thought I have told her the earth is flat. So then she said, no, that's wrong. I've never heard that. And here's what people always, I went to Catholic schools all my life. I'm like, okay, great. But you still can't eat that donut before you go in if you're going to go to communion. And you just take and so then when we got in, I showed her in the missal where it says, ordinarily you are to have fasted 1 hour. And she was really upset. She said, nobody ever taught me this. I didn't know this. I mean, it's a little, in the greater scheme of eternity, it's a little thing, right? But for me, it was just reflective, like, we really do have lay people. They want to know. She was a little embarrassed. And I felt bad because I didn't intend to embarrass her. We were joking around, but we have to be very careful in how we approach educating laity. We don't want them to feel as if we're looking down on them in any way. That's important. But, the new Pew study that came out just maybe 18 months ago, I think the most terrifying statistic, Fran, in that study is that if you only go to CCD, so you go to public schools and you go to your parish's religious education program for grade school and high school, 95% of those people leave the church by the time they are adults.
Heavens, it's terrible.
95%. And you talk to any pastors, they'll tell you a lot of these families, they are not bad people. They want some kind of religious formation for their families, right? But confirmation is kind of like Catholic graduation. And once you're done with that, you see them at Christmas and Easter, sometimes not even then, but many of them, they're gone, they leave the church, they cohabitate at higher levels. And so I think, what we kind of started this by talking about Joe Biden's, Catholicism. I think you have a pretty large percentage of people who might say, wow, he carries a rosary. That's, that to them might be the, kind of epitome of a really serious Catholic, because their grandmother carried a rosary. And she was a great Catholic. And, I've heard, I heard one celebrity on television, I think it was on American Idol or something, saying, oh, you would not believe how serious a Catholic my grandma is. She goes every Sunday to mass. Every Sunday. And I'm, and so you're talking about like stuff that's the absolute, like, lower level minimum, and that's now become Mother Teresa, right? So that's where I think the Napa Institute's goals and ambitions of really equipping lay people to be able to teach the faith to others, to share it in a way where it's engaging and it's not threatening to anybody, that's going to be a tremendous and very much needed gift for the church going forward.
Mary, you're terrific, and you've just been wonderful in this interview. I'm very grateful for the time. And
well,
God bless you in your own work.
Always a pleasure to work with. I'll tell you one quick thing. You don't even have, you can cut me out but Cardinal George one time brought me in one of Archbishop Chaput's talks, and kind of he would toss things on my desk from time to time. And he said, "You should read this." And I read it. I said, "This is great." He's like, "He's got that really smart guy who writes some of his stuff for him. You should call him sometimes." No,
Well,
that was you. That was my introduction to you. I didn't know who you were, so I just wanted to let you know. I know you.
I'm not sure that part's going to make the interview.
Yeah,
but anyway,
that's the truth. That did happen. He did say that to me. So at any rate, thank you for having me. This has been such a joy. It's always so interesting to speak with you.
God bless you.
All right.
Thanks so much, Mary.
Have a good one. All right. Bye-bye now. Thank you.